now. It will be posted up on our website after the meeting, and it's 4:02, a meeting that was supposed to start at 4. So I'd like to please introduce Sheriff Brandon Barnes to get our meeting going, and thank you everybody for attending.
Yeah, good evening, everybody, or I guess late afternoon, depending on your preference. Just wanted to start out by saying I really appreciate everybody who's worked on the committees and the work teams, and they've taken the time to give their input. And also thank you to those tonight from our community that have taken the time to join us. You know, we've been at this for well over a year due to the pandemic. It's you know, while it's kind of delayed the process a little bit, I know that there's been a lot of good work going on behind the scenes. And so we're happy to kind of work through this tonight and see where we're at. I know, Allison, I think you wanted some of the committees to kind of introduce themselves and say what they're representing. So I'll defer back to you for that for just a minute.
Thank you so much. Yes, so I know we've all been adapting to Zoom meetings over the last year and a half or so. What I would really appreciate if I could have the executive steering committee members introduce themselves and the organization that they're with. And I can go through the members. I'll call on you if you could please just let the group know your name and your organization, your affiliation. That would be wonderful. Sheriff Barnes, we can start with you.
Sure thing. So Brandon Barnes, Sutter County Sheriff's Office.
Thank you. And I have Abray Connor.
Hi, yes, Abray Connor, she, her pronouns. I'm the directing attorney for the health program at the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley.
Wonderful. And Pamela Liu.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pamela Liu, she, her pronouns. I'm a senior attorney at Disability Rights California. We are statewide, and I'm located down in LA.
Wonderful. And Chief Para, you are new to our executive steering committee. Welcome, Chief Para.
Okay, got figured out the mute button. Sorry. So Eric Para, I am the chief of Alhambra Police Department. I formerly spent 31 years with the LA Sheriff's Department, the last 4 or 5 of which I ran the jail system. So I'm glad to be on board.
Welcome, thank you. Jerry Gutierrez.
Hi, Jerry Gutierrez. I'm responsible for the Detention and Corrections Support Bureau, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. And I've been involved with BSCC off and on for many, many years.
Thank you. Erin Winger.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Erin Winger. I'm the Director for Correctional Health Services for County of Orange Healthcare Agency.
Excellent, thank you. Christine Brown-Taylor, I think I saw you in there.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Christine Brown-Taylor. I'm the Reentry Services Manager for the San Diego Sheriff's Department.
Wonderful, thank you. Rick Heyer, are you in here? And I think I was able to call on all of the executive steering members that I knew were participating this evening. Did I miss anybody? Sometimes it's hard to see everybody on the screen. Okay, well, we will get started. We will get started. So, excuse me. I'd like to also thank all of the executive steering committee members, all the work group members that got together over the past year, the public members and stakeholders who were able to comment and provide information throughout this process, and especially the really hard work of the BSCC team, all the field representatives and the analysts who spent lots and lots of time working on this project. And Ginger Wolf, who is here taking our notes for us, is really invaluable to this process. So our objectives here for this evening are to review the initial revisions that have been presented to the Executive Steering Committee. The questions that we're thinking about and hoping that the ESC is able to consider is, do these initial revisions reflect the ESC recommendations that were presented quite some time ago, and are they aligned with best practices? Identify any regulation revisions that are ready for ESC approval, excuse me, and identify any regulations where there might need to be more discussion and work. We're going to get through as many of these regulations as possible this evening, and we certainly will. We'll have some time at the end of the meeting for the Executive Steering Committee to consider when to hold another Executive Steering Committee meeting. I will talk about how the public is able to participate throughout this meeting in just a moment. And I want to try to get through some of the explanatory stuff really quick. We have a lot of work to do, but I did want to provide an update on where we're at and where this process has gone, especially for people who are new to this process. Back in October 2019, after seeking public comment, the ESC did meet to provide the BSDC team with direction for proposing revisions to the adult Titles 15 and 24 regulations. And then I have a note for myself that says insert pandemic here, because I don't think anybody expected what happened after that. Our subject matter expert work groups were set to meet in early 2020. I think we had 2 meet in person before that changed to the subject matter expert work groups meeting throughout the year in 2020. It took a long time to get through the material on Zoom. Those of you that have been involved in the process in the past, typically they were 1 or 2 and sometimes 3 8-hour day meetings. So it really was a challenge to get through all of this material, but thanks to the BSCC team and the stakeholders and community members that participated, we did get through it. The BSCC team got through and wrapped up all of the recommendations that came from those subject matter expert work groups and public comments. And we're now presenting those to the Executive Steering Committee to make sure that they meet approval and when they are ready for BSCC board approval. So also a quick note about what's going to happen after this meeting. When the Executive Steering Committee is comfortable saying that these revisions or whatever revisions are approved, the BSCC will prepare the materials for BSCC board approval. So the next step in the process is to have the BSCC board approve all regulation revisions. We're hoping that's later this year. November will be ideal. After the BSCC board approval, the BSCC will open a 45-day public comment period, after which, in which we begin the state rulemaking process. And once the 45-day public comment period is over, regulations are then processed by another state agency, the Office of Administrative Law, and they become final about 6 months later, just so people can get a sense of, you know, the regulations won't be final until about 6 months after they get to the Office of Administrative Law, which is typically a month or 2 after BSCC board approval. And a quick note about the environmental and nutritional health regulations. Those revisions will happen on a separate track. We weren't able to get to those subject matter expert work groups during the pandemic, but they will occur and be processed into the regulation revision and rulemaking periods. So that's a lot of words for a really lengthy and long process. And again, I can't thank people enough for sticking with us throughout this process. And we have a lot to get through, and I'm going to ask Sheriff Barnes to talk about how we're going to walk through the process. And before we step into the articles and how we walk through this, I'll let everybody know how we're going to take public comment throughout.
Okay. Thank you, Allison. Yeah, I think what's probably most appropriate as you're sharing your screen there would be to just go down each article. And then within those, if there are ones that need recommended changes or revisions, as I understand it, you or your staff will kind of explain what those are, and then we'll open it up to discussion within the Executive Steering Committee and then public comment as well. I would also just note that if there's something on there that doesn't have a proposed revision and somebody wants to add something, please make us aware of that. As you can see in the first section there are no proposed revisions. So some of these may go quickly, others may require more discussion. I'd also like to emphasize that, you know, I don't think we're trying to rush through this. We're trying to create a good product. So if there are things that are simple, like a name change or just a word change, we may, you know, approve those. But if there are things that require more in-depth discussion, we're happy to take that under advisement, go back, do more research, and then, you know, make additional changes if that seems appropriate, so that we're meeting best standards and best practices. So hopefully that sounds okay to everybody. Allison, did you want to touch on the public comment real quick before we get rolling then?
Yes, please. So what I'm sharing on my screen is a form that's available on our website as well in PDF and in Word version. So people that are interested can open this up in Word and take notes for themselves. And it outlines each of the regulations that are going to be discussed. The ones that are highlighted are regulations where there is a revision attached to them. The ones that are not highlighted don't currently have revisions in them. So as Sheriff Barnes mentioned, we'll take a look generally at each article, and if there is interest in pulling out one of those regulations for discussion, if one of the ESC members could please let us know, and then we can also check with members of the public that are in attendance. So how we will then basically work through each regulation in order. If none are pulled out, if they don't have revision, we'll start with, for instance, 1010 applicability of standards. BSCC staff will give a brief overview. I'll be able to show everybody on the screen the regulation that we're talking about. We will, excuse me, we will ask the ESC members for discussion. The ESC is the body that provided information to BSCC staff to make the revisions, allow for ESC discussion. And before we move on to the next regulation, we will open up for public comment. So at the end of each regulation and discussion, Sheriff Barnes, our chair, will call for any public comment. And our moderator, Adam Nguyen, who many of you know from our board meetings and is fantastic. If you'd like to comment, raise your hand at that point or put your name in the chat, and Adam will call on you in the order in which he either sees your hand or sees your name in the chat. So once we do a couple of these, I'm sure it will feel a lot more natural. But again, we're going to introduce the regulation, super brief update on what the changes are, if they're substantive or not, allow for ESC discussion, and then allow for public comment in each of those areas. And again, and we've talked about this, we had a meeting last week to talk about how the regulations work. We welcome any and all public comment. What is helpful, however, to know is what your revision is, what you'd like to see in the regulation, and the rationale behind that revision will help us as staff determine if what a revision could look like. So never done this over Zoom. I'm just gonna put this out there, and we're just gonna get started, and I'm looking forward to moving this process along. So Sheriff Barnes, we'll start with Article 1.
Sure. Yeah, Article 1, general instructions. As you can see, there are 4 areas there. There are no recommended revisions for any of those categories. So unless somebody would like to pull one of those for discussion, I'll pause a few minutes to allow for that. Otherwise, we will move on to Article 2. Okay, seeing no requests. Article 2, 1010, applicability of standards is the first one. There is a revision, and so I will kick it back to Allison.
So we start with what we call a non-substantive change, in that the regulation for applicability of standards simply lists out which regulations apply to which types of detention facility. And you'll see in a further revision that the name the name for appeal process was changed to local detention of appeal process. So there's no substantive change to 1010 other than changing the name where 1018 is referred to in 1010. And it's a really long regulation. And what it does is show which regulations in Title 15 apply to which types of facilities. Happy to take any discussion or questions.
Yeah, so in this one, it was just a name change. So is there any discussion from the ESC first? We'll start there.
None for me.
Okay, hearing none, we'll open it up to public comment. Okay, no public comment.
And so as, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Please go ahead, Allison.
Oh, I was just going to mention, we are looking for consensus and the ESC's consensus on moving ahead with this regulation, and no other changes or no other work by the BSCC. And we don't have to take a vote. We can simply, if there are ESC members that aren't in agreement, we can pull it off for further discussion. So if there isn't further discussion, we'll note it as no further action needed.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think it's appropriate to forward that to the board for consideration of change. I don't have any objections to it. Okay. The next one is 1012, emergency suspensions of standards or requirements. And I see on the far right there, it said that it was further review or something to that effect.
Yes, so BSCC staff flagged this issue, and you can see on the screen that there were no revisions recommended to this regulation. However, we use the emergency or agencies use the emergency suspensions of standard pretty sporadically in the past, usually to deal with the H1N1 flu was a good example of when agencies were suspending standards, visiting or outdoor exercise for a certain amount of times to reduce the chance of an outbreak. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's also available on our website, many agencies were suspending standards related to things like visitation or specific programming, things like that. And what we wanted to call attention to is that technically an agency can do an emergency of suspension of standards for up to 3 days without notifying the board. And then after that, if a suspension is going to last longer than 15 days, the chairperson of the board has to approve that standard. We made a policy decision when the suspensions began to have our board chair, Linda Penner, review those suspensions every 15 and then eventually every 30 days, which isn't in the regulation. So we just wanted to call this out because it was a not paid attention to very often regulation, but it's one we had to use regularly. So just wanted to see if the ESC had any comments or discussion or recommendations related to this regulation.
I read the suggested considerations on this particular one. I think it's appropriate leaving it the way it is from a person who's had to implement it with H1N1 and with the COVID-19. Obviously, these things do not occur regularly, thank goodness. But when they do, an agency needs to have the flexibility without being hampered with bureaucracy to explain away things that they're trying to accomplish when their goal is to keep everybody healthy and alive and keep the jails operational. So if they did submit a mitigation plan, what would be the purpose of that? Who would be evaluating that? That's where I get to the point where that agency knows best. They're on the ground managing their jail system. I don't see a need to add more requirements on them if they are declaring an emergency.
This is Pamela Liu, member of the Executive Steering Committee. I really thank staff for flagging this one. And I think my concern is that I feel like we don't know enough. And I almost feel this should go back to a work group, because what I had heard was that some county jails were suspending a number of requirements, and that was continuing fairly indefinitely. The rationale being COVID. And I don't know that there appears to be a process if members of the public, for example, on visitation or other issues, don't think that's appropriate. There seems to be no way other than having someone on the board either approve or not, the chairperson of the board. And so, like I said, I just feel like I don't have enough information, but I think COVID actually demonstrated how this could be really problematic.
And so two things that aren't in this regulation that that you mentioned, Pamela, is that there's no ongoing approval process. So we built one in for that reason. Again, that's not reflected in the regulation. And we also did ask agencies to please submit those mitigation plans. And our board chair does review those every 30 days. Some are dropping off, but that's the process that was put in. It's just not stated in regulation. That's exactly the discussion point. So.
And the
And I
other
think
part would be that just making some of these mitigation plans public, because there's just, for example, we saw that a lot in nursing homes that flat out denied any visitors and just made a blanket rule. And that required advocacy with Department of Public Health to say, this is too blanket, this is too across the board. There's not enough considerations of other factors. And so I don't think that I, as a ESC member, have enough information to just change this regulation right now. And I'm wondering if there's a way to send it back to a work group or get further input from the public and from concerned parties.
Allison, if I may add a point on there too, you're right on point on that, where regularly every 15 days or so, we're having to speak to our BSCC representative who covers our jail system in their area to talk about the current status, the mitigation efforts we were taking. But a lot of that, regardless of our efforts, were kind of being superseded by the governor's order to limit movement and activities within the state. So it kind of overruled a lot of these things, regardless, just trying to keep the jail systems operational where they needed to be. So I mean, there's a lot of things going on, and hopefully we don't go through something like this anytime soon.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to add too, I think a lot of those comments are spot on. I would also consider, if it gets looked at further, that a lot of the jails were interfacing and taking some local direction from their county health officers as well.
Yes.
On how to handle these things. And I know the pandemic's fresh in our mind, but I guess depending on what it is, it could be different regionally from North State to South State kind of thing. And so I think we have to be mindful of that as well, that we may not all be experiencing the same exact problem at the same time.
Yeah, this is Bray. I tend to also agree that I think we need more information, and also that the definition of emergency, there are a few places where I feel like it's a little broad. And so because the definition of emergency is a little broad in certain places, like what exactly is a riot, that this could be used in a way that could mean a lot of different things. And so I think that us getting more information and then maybe really kind of zeroing in on what is actually being considered an emergency would also help with 1012.
Okay. Well, I do note that it is checked yes in the box for requires further discussion. Is there any other comments from the ESC before we move to public comment? Okay.
And just one quick note, the definite emergency is defined currently in regulation, and I'll bring this screen over. Things are all over the place in this information, so you can see here Currently, emergency means any significant disruption of normal facility procedure, policies, or activities caused by a riot, fire, earthquake, attack, strike, or other emergent conditions. And I do hear what you're saying, right? One could lead to another. So certainly something that could be pushed back to staff for further review.
Okay.
Are we ready for public comment?
Yeah, is there any public comment?
Adam?
Yes, we have two public comments. The first one, I'm going to call on Avalon.
Hi, everybody. So yeah, I hadn't reviewed this before this meeting, but taking a look at it now, I'd say find it pretty concerning that this item allows flat out permission to suspend any standard or requirement in an emergency. It's pretty unimaginable to me considering the breadth of what these standards include. Things as basic as voting, use of force procedures, shackling, grievance procedures. It's, unless I'm misunderstanding, I think that allows agencies a ton of leeway whenever there's a state of emergency declared to deny people pretty basic services. Mr. Gutierrez said that the agency knows best because they're on the ground, and I just firmly have to disagree with that after seeing how the basic rights of incarcerated people were stripped from them during COVID-19, especially in Riverside County. I appreciate the contributions of Pamela specifically, but I think it's pretty evident that this regulation needs a significant change precisely because there wasn't enough oversight of these long-term programming deprivations over the last 15 months. I can only speak to what I know about Riverside County, but people in Riverside County were literally in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day for practically the entire duration of the pandemic. So they got less than an hour of out of cell time to shower, access the commissary, and call their loved ones. So there'd go days at a time where people couldn't contact their loved ones because they didn't have enough time. And also during that time, they were deprived in-person visitation rights up until January for Riverside County and then up until March for San Bernardino County. All of that is to say, like, deprivation of rights and programming, giving just a flat out okay for that is just, I think, pretty blatantly unacceptable. And the pandemic is proof of that. So I agree that this needs to go back to a work group for further consideration.
Okay, thank you. And there's a second public comment?
Yes, I have Andrea.
Thank you. Andrea Garcia Ponce de Leon with San Bernardino Freedom All. And I really do agree with some of the commenting that Pamela provided. This absolutely should go back to a work group. And as Avalon mentioned in their comment, that a lot of concern around folks being kept inside of confinement for so long, sometimes even beyond 23, 24 hours a day, and not being able to come out regularly over such an extended period of time definitely needs to be addressed. And there should be a work in where you have an alternative. If you're going to suspend visiting for a year, then there absolutely should be something in its place, such as a video visitations, for example, and as well as programming. If programming is not going to be ongoing and is going to be halted, there should definitely be something else in its place. We met with San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department in regards to this and inquiring whether or not the tablet program or pilot program could be extended, because it was at a perfect time when people should have been given that opportunity and could have been utilizing the tablet to be productive and to learn or to even keep in touch with their family members. We see that this would have been the perfect opportunity there to start that program during the pandemic and during the shutdown of both visiting and programming. We also even offered to provide correspondence courses that we would pay for, although we were really basically put off on that and we're told this wasn't going to happen or be reviewed for possibly another 2 years because of funding. We have seen CDCR be successful at having video visitation, tablet programming given to everyone, or allowed access to everyone within the facilities. So we don't see that this should be very hard of a thing that couldn't be figured out and worked into. So that is really our concern, is if you are going to make these restrictions, that you have something in its place to substitute, so people are not just sitting and on dead time, and they're being productive and being able to keep in contact with their loved ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I apologize. In my eagerness to start the meeting, I did neglect to say that we're going to ask commenters to please keep comments to 1 minute in order to keep the meeting moving. If you run overtime or need more time, please email us at regulations@bscc.ca.gov. And 1 minute, please. Thank you so much. And I apologize for not mentioning it earlier. And Adam, do we have another commenter?
Yes, we do. We have Robin. Robin, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I want to echo what Andrea and Avalon said. I find it deeply concerning how unclear this language is, and the fact that it doesn't include anything regarding alternative programming or programming to continue during lockdowns and other emergencies. I think it's a bit short-sighted to think that emergency protocols won't continue happening in the future. This pandemic is not ending anytime soon, and future ones will probably be on the way. Regarding the sort of boots on the ground comment, I have incarcerated loved ones in San Diego County and state facilities. I'm also, I've been providing programming in Sheriff Gore's facilities and CDCR facilities for about 6 years. So I am also boots on the ground, and program providers are the reason that facilities are able to call themselves rehabilitative institutions. And so I would like more program provider presence in things like the steering committee and stakeholder discussions. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have no other public comment at this time.
Thank you, Adam.
Great. Thank you, Adam. So I think, obviously, I think we're all in agreement that that needs to go back for some further discussion and recommendations. So moving on to the next one, I don't know, Allison, if you need to shoot back to Article 2. So 1013 and 1016 have no recommended revisions. The next one is 1018, which is appeals, and there is a noted revision for that.
Yes, thank you. So as I mentioned, this is the same one that you saw in 1010. The original title of this regulation was appeal, and the appeal is intended for local detention facilities to appeal to the executive director or the board regarding a decision made about compliance or non-compliance in an agency. So the work group opted to change the name to make it more clear, the local detention facility appeal process. And there are no other changes in that regulation, just the name change. And I can scroll through so people can look. I'm happy to stop or answer any questions.
Okay. Any comments from the ESC? Okay, hearing none. Any public comment?
We have no public comments for this item.
Okay, thank you, Adam. I'll let, okay, I thought Allison was still scrolling. So with that being said, I think it's appropriate to forward that one to the board for consideration of approval. Which takes us down to Article 3, training, personnel, and management. 10, 20, 21, and 23 have no recommended revisions. The next one recommended is 1024, colt holding and temporary holding facility training.
Give me a minute to go back up. So this regulation outlines the minimum training that needs to be provided for personnel in court holding facilities and in temporary holding facilities. A lot of changes have been made to make the regulation more clear, that the 8 hours is completed for all supervisors of and personnel in these local detention facilities. And work group also elected to add to the minimums instruction and training on de-escalation, juvenile procedures, racial bias, and mental illness. Keeping that training shall be completed as soon as practical, not more than 6 months after the date of assigned responsibility. And then going on to be clear that the total number of training hours are 8 hours once every 2 years. And the total is called out to accommodate flexibility for agencies that might do trainings at briefings or roll call or in snippets rather than in one 8-hour setting. So other than adding some important elements to the 8-hour training, no other recommendations have been made. And again, this does not apply to county jails, type 2 and 3 and type 1 facilities. It applies to court holding facilities and temporary holding facilities, shorter term facilities.
Okay. Any discussion from the ESC?
I have some thoughts. One being, and I know that this is to make things more clear. When I look at this, when I actually look at the list right now, expecting that all of this is going to be covered in 8 hours, and I understand that a facility could potentially do more than 8 hours. I understand that. But in reality, the likelihood that, you know, like if we have in here 8 hours, I think that most places are going to try to get all of this done in 8 hours. And to me, I just don't think that that's actually enough time to get through each of these topics. And so maybe this is something where we actually need a little bit more to figure out whether or not actually going through this entire list in 8 hours is possible. I mean, to me, like even just doing cultural competency around racial bias, that could be 8 hours in and of itself. Mental health issues, mental, disabilities. From what I see from the work that we do within our patients' rights work, I think that there additionally that could take, like a lot longer than maybe, I don't know, for to have all of these and to, even if you're spending 30 minutes to an hour potentially on each topic, I just don't think that that's enough time, especially considering that these are individuals who are going to be interacting with incarcerated folks and supervising folks who are interacting with incarcerated folks on a regular basis. And so I would really challenge us to maybe look at the number of hours and the amount of time, like every, I think that we should also look at potentially increasing the frequency as well, especially considering that there are different issues that may come up as we've seen with the pandemic. Waiting 2 years may not actually be, we may need to revisit that. So I think that this is something where we need more information.
And I did want to thank you for, it's an important recognition that it is the minimum, understanding that some agencies certainly will provide more. And I do want to point out, and just as a point of interest, that this is in addition to whatever other training, say if it's a patrol trained person, it's in addition to all of the other training that individual receives. Just for informational purposes, it is a minimum and it is in addition to other trainings. It's for people in that are supervising people in short-term positions, short-term holding.
Yeah, no, I get that. I still think it needs to be longer.
No, I agree. Yeah.
But thank you. I do appreciate that for purposes of like everyone but I still think it needs to be longer and this is not enough time.
Hey, Allison, on this particular section here, and obviously with the intent of this section years ago is to provide the basic bare bones standards that needed to be done to safely house somebody in a temporary holding facility. They raised some really great topics that probably would be great to beneficial for employees who supervise prisoners in this environment. But is this the right section for this? And is this more so for their initial, like you mentioned, the peace officer training? They're getting a lot of this in the basic peace officer academy. They're getting a lot of this, if not all of it, in their basic correctional core course. Either way, they have to go through one of those career tracks in order to supervise somebody, an inmate within these areas. So I'm wondering if this is something that maybe should be inserted more in a core course type thing, or a recommendation on the post side, and not necessarily here, because the amount of hours provided, I agree with a bit. There's not enough time to cover that. So I don't know if this is the best place for this to be.
That's actually that's a really like a good point of discussion, and people that have read these regulations and have participated in or have supervised people who've gone through the core training. So that is the formal, oh gosh, I'm going to get the number wrong. Let's say around 200 hours for correctional personnel, people whose full-time job is supervising people who are housed in local detention facilities. And where this particular regulation differs and why it came to be is because in court holding facilities and temporary holding facilities, there might be a personnel who didn't go through the correctional track. They might work patrol. They might be a bailiff that doesn't work or hadn't worked in detention facilities before. So the intent of it way back when it was started was to address that gap between, the difference between working in an assignment other than a detention facility.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking, because the trial court funding doesn't really cover a lot of the costs associated with sheriff's offices managing the court systems to begin with. So maybe this is a better served to try to get it more in the initial training. And don't forget, both tracks, career tracks, work with the posts, it's 24 hours biannual, and with the VSCC correctional professionals, it's 24 hours every year. So there's a lot of ways where this training could be addressed and not necessarily squeezed into this 1024. That's all I am saying. I think the topics are important, but I don't think this is necessarily the spot where it needs to be.
And we could certainly do some research into that. I know post courses have changed over the years. Certainly our core courses have changed over the years. And a lot of times you can, overlay one over the other. So
I know in the core course, de-escalation, mental illness, those are covered in core courses now. So that's where I'm getting at, where we should probably, I think everyone's trying to do the right thing and inject these in certain areas, but not really looking at the whole system and the program as a whole. And maybe it's already covered, or maybe we can tighten up those areas where it is covered to add additional language that may be necessary or needed in the opinion of the board. And we take it from there.
I would agree with that completely. I think we need to deconflict what is occurring with initial training right now and how long, because somebody's been out of the system. If they haven't gone through initial training in a long time and they come in as a supervisor and it's maybe been years since they went through it, they would probably need to go through the whole course. And I don't think you could get through this in 8 hours. It would be truly inadequate. But I do know de-escalation, racial bias, mental illness is covered regularly in many other areas now. So I think we need to deconflict and figure out where those are covered and really narrow this list down to the things that the supervisor would need to know and be current on for the jail system.
Yeah, I think a lot of those comments are all spot on. You do cover that stuff in the core course. And I don't think there's any expectation that all of those things listed there are all part of one remedial course. I think to Eric's point, you do get mental illness and suicide prevention in, usually a 4 to 8 hour course annually in some departments. So that covers those two areas. And so you would certainly exceed your 8 hours. De-escalation is covered in defensive tactics. It's covered on the range. It's covered in a lot of other things that we would be doing. And so I think you would touch on all of these areas throughout the course of the year. So we probably just need to better define what the expectations are and where it fits best.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that too is on the second paragraph down where and I didn't catch it before, but it requires this training within 6 months.
Right.
That's the only training requirement out of all of the initial trainings, from a new sergeant promoted into a jail system, a custodial officer going to a jail system, where they have to do it within 12 months of the first year. It'd be nice if that language was consistent with the other ones, because I'm sure that gets confused from time to time.
Okay. Are there any public comments?
Yes, Chair. I have Avalon Edward, who wants to talk on section 1020, 1021, 1023, and 1024.
Okay. So we're happy to go back and revisit that. Are there any public comments on 1024? Let's finish this one up and then we'll circle back to those.
Yes, I have two for 1024. That would be Avalon.
Okay, please, Avalon, go ahead.
Yeah, I put this in the chat, but I would really appreciate if you could go one by one for the items on the agenda and ask for public comment after each one, instead of skipping to the ones that require ESC discussion. Because I think the conversation about 1020, 1021, and 1023 could have advised the conversation on, or informed the conversation on 1024. That being said, I just wanted to state that I agree with Aubrey about the minimum number of hours not being sufficient, especially if it's not required for everybody who's working these positions to complete the core training. Even if you just like added hours proportionally to how many trainings were added to this list, you would need to add at least between 6 to 7 hours minimum to match like 4 new trainings. So we're looking at like 15 hours minimum of specialized corrections training. That being said, I think it should be much higher, especially if we're covering things like de-escalation is a lifelong skill. So I agree that that could be a week-long training on its own. And I know that this is a minimum standards decision, but at the very least, I think this timing needs to be doubled for the minimum. But yeah, I will loop back to the core training.
And next we have Renee Menard for item 1024.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Renee Menard with the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice. I'll keep it short because I do think that both Aubrey and Avalon shared some of the insights that I too was concerned with. Recognizing that there were already 5 items for 8 hours, and with the addition of 4 items, I do think that these are important. I understand these might be covered in other areas, and I'm not sure if, if those things can suffice for this requirement. I do think it's important to name it here in these regulations, recognizing that, it was stated that de-escalation might be covered in other areas, mental illness and suicide prevention is annually in some departments. I think that this is really an opportunity to streamline the expectations for all departments across California's various local facilities. So just want to reiterate, I do think that these are important, and they are they're areas that change on a regular basis. Our understanding of each of these sections really does require regular training, especially for those who are in a supervision role. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Renee. Adam, were there any other comments on 1024?
None at this time. I'm calling all the public commenters. If you have anything right now, please raise your hands for 1024.
And if there's no more public comment, what I hear from the ESC and certainly from public comment is that there needs to be a recognition and a looking at the minimum number of hours. And so staff can survey and seek some feedback on hours and expectations, and that can be something that we work on for the next ESC meeting as well. So I'm hearing that back to staff for further review.
Yes.
And I just wanted, not on specific to this, but as an ESC member, I noticed that there was a public comment about requesting public comment after each item, even if it hasn't been one that was previously recommended for revision. And I agree with that, because even though there's just so many regulations here at DRC, we brought a specific area of expertise, but I definitely would like to hear from the numerous people who come to this meeting in case there's something that we've missed. I think that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
And
go ahead, Alvin.
So I just want to confirm and just double checking with the chair and the ESC. I'm very happy to go through each one. What we started out was with asking if anybody had comments on anyone that wasn't highlighted. But if the ESC would rather ask for public comment on each one, we can do that as well.
Yeah, and I apologize if I didn't.
Yeah,
I thought I was asking and then
Yeah.
pausing. And if
We
no one
didn't-
commented, we moved on to the
Yeah.
next one that had a marked revision on it, so.
Yeah.
So I will name 1020 and I will wait 15 seconds to see if there's public comment, and then if not, we'll move on. So 1020,
Yes, Chair, we have Avalon for 1020.
okay, please, Avalon, go ahead.
So my comment, I believe, applies equally to 1020, 1021, and 1023. And I hope, honestly, that I'm wrong about understanding the contents of core courses. But as far as I understand, corrections officers, jail supervisors, and managerial personnel can go an entire year working their assignment before undergoing their core training. I can't think of a single other profession where you could go an entire year without any professional training, especially if you're working with people in custody, which requires highly specialized training to do well, to keep people safe. So I'm hoping I'm misunderstanding that, but that should be zero. I mean, that should be the first step for anyone hired to any of these positions, should be undergoing that core training, even if it's 200 hours long. To be a teacher, you go through years of training before you step foot in a classroom as a certified teacher. So I would appreciate some clarification on that, because for 1020, 1021, and 1023, it states that you can go a full year without undergoing your core training in your position. So I'd appreciate some clarification on that.
So these regulations, they are aligned with the standards and trainings for corrections, and you can see it's referred to in that regulation, section 179 of Title 15, California Code of Regulations. And those, the STC regulations are actually the regulations that require the core training and within a year. So this section of Title 15 refers to those. I don't think that that's the answer that you're looking for, but just so mechanically and operationally, you know where they came from. And the same regulations are referred to in that other section that STC refers to. And certainly there are best practices related to getting training as soon as possible. And I certainly welcome anybody to discuss this as well. I don't think there's ever a time that it's an ideal time to go without a day on the job, without proper training, or without something like core training. But it's not always possible. There aren't always training courses available, and there are best practices outlined in some national best practices in making sure that people are assigned with a partner or a field training officer, so that there is a recognition that people won't necessarily be assigned without having training on them. I'm going to ask other people to weigh in on that discussion.
Any other comments?
Yes, I would like to touch on it myself. My name is James Martinez. Just thinking about that, right? I mean, me, myself, I'm in my first year at Sacramento State University, and they're preparing me to practice my discipline, right? My discipline is philosophy with an emphasis of ethics, politics, and law. And just to take that into consideration, just really examining that, having someone to go in and do something without the proper training is one, very concerning, because people's lives are at stake. One, the individual that you're sending in to do something that, one, they're not clear, they're not trained, they're not given the proper tools to fulfill the position, and to expect them to show up and fulfill a job description without knowing it, I think it's like impossible. And I say that because that's like asking someone to do something that they don't know what's being asked. And taking that into consideration, it's important for us to understand that it's unacceptable to send someone into a position, and as Avalon had mentioned, and just highlighting and riffing off what she had mentioned, it's setting someone up for failure, y'all. And I think this is something that needs to be revisited along with a lot of these regulations that are, being proposed to be changed. And I'll be highlighting some other areas as we move on, but I think this is something that needs to go back to the ESC board and also get public comment and give more time for the community to weigh in on this issue. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, James. Any other comments?
At this time, I have no other public comment.
Okay.
Is it-
Anything? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so then just procedurally, I'm a little unclear about what we can do with this. I guess this is a question for Allison, because I'm pretty shocked. Like the public comment has been about, and I understand the difficulties in counties where it might be hard to get people fully trained in time, but that does seem like a long period of time when you're doing such an important job. So wondering how we can address that.
I think it's important to recognize too, and it may have misunderstood a bit, but so what we're talking about here is the actual core course with the initial training academy that these individuals will go through. That is the first part of training. Then there's also a second part, which is normally, I'm just talking general terms here, an on-the-job training program, like a corrections training officer program, where they're with a mentor who's evaluating them and training them on the job. It's not like these individuals are showing up for work and then on their own. That isn't how it works either. So I just want to make sure there is some training involved. It's just the core course itself. I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, and I think I would just expand on that. All departments have a training program internally. And it doesn't mean that you wait a full year to go. You go in many cases to the next available course.
Right.
So from the time you get hired, if the next available course is in 2 months or 3 months, generally you're signed up to go attend that academy. And so it's not like you're going a full year in most cases without any level of training.
So procedurally, I mean, much like some of the other ones that we've talked about, and again, in the interest of time, I mean, the things that come to our mind or my mind is collaborating a bit with the standards and training for correction team here at BSCC and make sure that we are aligning these regulations with theirs. Certainly, and I think this is where that minimum standard comes in. And again, just as things that we've seen in the past, I'm not trying to make a judgment call one way or the other, but there are agencies that aren't able to get their staff members to that full core course right before they begin a job. And so those agencies, they do take efforts and efforts to make sure that those staff members receive training relevant to their job and that they're not just sent out without a mentor or without a training officer. And I know that's not reflected in regulation. So what would be helpful is to have some comparison with the STC regulations and see where maybe there are some places where best practices could be inserted in this particular regulation.
Yeah, I think that's probably appropriate. And as I suspect with 21 and 23, we'll probably have a similar request, which is to maybe just evaluate all of the training section in general, just to make sure that we're in compliance with STC standards and best practices. Okay. Any other comments on 1020?
No further comments at this time.
Okay.
And just a reminder, just a reminder, we have a lot of people on this meeting. If you're going to provide public comment, just raise your hand or put your name in the chat. We have one person dedicated to making sure that everybody gets heard. Thank you so much for helping us with that flow.
Okay, next is 1021, jail supervisory training. I'll pause for comment if there is any.
And just just for historical purposes, and if it's helpful, I can provide some of that. So this is not intended for the entry-level line staff that's coming to work in a detention facility. This is when a supervisor, in some facilities, it's a corporal or a sergeant, is coming in to supervise line staff, and perhaps they haven't had core training. So it's to ensure that supervisors have the same training as their supervisees, for lack of a better term.
Okay. Adam, was there any comment?
Avalon did mention that she wanted to discuss 10/20, 21, and 23. Do you still have anything to mention for 10/21?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, no, my comments are the same. I think I'm just going to reiterate something that I put in the chat, which is that I think any of these trainings, regardless of the position, like before somebody becomes a jail supervisor, they should have to go undergo this training before they are considered a supervisor. I think that's pretty common sense. So before, same thing for 10/20, 10/21, 10/23, before you are considered to be in that position, I believe somebody should have to undergo the entire training for the core course. I guess I have a point of clarification, Allison. I think I didn't fully understand what you're saying. Are you saying that the BSCC standards cannot go beyond what the standards and training for corrections rules are? Because if they can't, then I understand. But if we can do better, then I would encourage the ESC to consider that.
They could be different, absolutely. But what I want to be sure of is that we're not creating conflicting standards. And maybe I didn't say that quite clearly. And STC just did a huge revision of their standards. So, and again, a lot of these processes didn't line up quite right in pandemic time. So I think it would be helpful to reacquaint ourselves with the STC standards, what those requirements are, and if it's possible, where to align with best practices if STC isn't already.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm done for this and the following then.
Okay. Thank you, Avalon. Was there any other comment on 10/23 then?
There are no other comments.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Moving down, any comments on 10/25, continuing professional training?
Sorry, this will just take me a minute to scroll. I apologize. And this is also a regulation that's aligned with the STC regulations that people who work in detention facilities receive their annual training. Those numbers do fluctuate. They are, I believe, 24 hours right now in STC. We didn't put the numbers in because, again, if STC changes, we didn't want to have to then change our regulations as well. Okay. You're on mute, Sheriff.
Sorry about that. Moving on from 10/25, any comments on 10/27? Number of personnel. Okay. Next is 10/27.5 safety checks.
It's a break. It's a break. I do have a bit of a sufficient, and I understand that there is a definition in here of what sufficient is, but to me, I do feel like this is something I may want a little bit more clarification on. Even the definition of what sufficient is, to me, still feels a little vague. So I actually would like for us as an executive steering committee to get a little bit more clarity about sufficient. Because I mean, in here it just says, it's like basically, based on what happens at the facility, and they're the ones who decide what's sufficient. So to me, I guess that's still very unclear. I don't know what that means. So I would like a little bit more information about that.
Sure, and there's no definition for sufficient. It certainly is a word that can be used a lot in regulation and require more clarification. And I'm going to speak from history and being the inspector that goes into local detention facilities. What this does is basically say, so we have all of these regulations, and if the BSCC sees that certain programs or operations are not getting done, and as we sift through the evidence and we interview people, and the reason why program services safety checks aren't getting done is because there's a lack of staff available to do those jobs. It gives us the opportunity to say, okay, you clearly don't have enough staff to run these programs, and we can call the agency out of compliance for not having sufficient staffing. So you'll see there's no staffing ratio in there. I'm sure that that discussion will come up. We have not seen, there is no one clear, consistent staffing ratio that's used in adult detention facilities across the country. There are some, but not one that works for everybody. So really what this provides is the BSCC can make a determination on being out of compliance for staffing because certain programs or services aren't being provided because of lack of staff. I hope that helps. That makes a lot of sense in my mind as a previous inspector. And happy to clarify more or answer any questions related to that.
Allison,
Yeah.
this is coming.
I'm sorry, Pamela or Lou.
Yes, Camila, I just had a quick question back to Allison about that. Could you give an example of when an insufficient number of personnel was determined? Just to help, so we can
Sure,
understand,
yeah.
how
So
that
really,
definition-
I pick on safety checks a lot. I'm not 100% sure, but so safety checks are required for all people on all people that are housed in local detention facilities, a minimum every 60 minutes. And we go into a facility and safety checks are being done every 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. They're clearly out of compliance with safety checks. But as we we don't just stop there and say, you're out of compliance with safety checks, fix it. We talk to the agency and talk to the people housed there, and we come to find out, well, yeah, there's only one person working the night, the graveyard shift, and there's 6 housing units, so they can't get to all of those safety checks. I mean, there's clearly a lack of staffing at the facility. We can also then call them out of compliance with number of personnel. That's one way. And you can see, there shall be at least one employee on duty at all times. It talks about, making sure that there's appropriate gender supervision in facilities. So it's an interesting regulation because it's not really prescriptive in that it says you must have staff to make sure that 3 meals a day are served. It's more about if 3 meals a day aren't getting served, because when the BSCC goes in there and it's because there's not enough staff to do it, then they can be out of compliance for that. So that's 2 examples.
I think, Allison, if this is going back to the a work group, can you please tell them not to focus on any type of ratios? Because an inmate ratio is not a good indication of what the staffing labor demand is going to be, because the jail design is what dictates the staffing demand normally. If it's a linear facility, a modern modular facility, or a direct supervision facility, which would require a lot more staff to work those areas. But to kind of add a little bit on some of that too, we're talking about security checks tend to be the primary indicator of showing of adequate staffing to safely house individuals. Their security safety cell checks, sobering cell checks, all of these things that require custody staff to check them regularly, as well as medical and mental health staff in those 2 last instances that I just mentioned. That's where you really start to look at the effectiveness of the current staffing plan, which any jail that's built in California has to submit a staffing plan to BSCC initially to approve it, along with that board to approve the staffing commitment to build that facility. So there's a lot of review processes, but over the years, they do probably require another look-see every now and then.
Okay. Any other comments from the ESC?
I'd like to just piggyback on what Jerry said. I think if I've looked at this nationally a few years ago and trying to get staffing ratio, staff to inmate, supervisor to the employees, to the subordinates, and it differs dramatically throughout the country. We're not going to be able to come up with a standard, which was disappointing to me because I thought there would be one, but there was not. It's clear that there was not. But I do think what Allison said makes sense in terms of this provision gives you the ability to determine what's sufficient based on are they not doing the security checks? Are inmates not getting to visits? Are they not getting to medical appointments? Are we not handling complaints? All those different criteria that you're looking at allows you to determine if they have sufficient staffing in there. We can try to drill down on this. I just don't know how much value, how much return on investment there's going to be in terms of time because of the lack of consistency nationally.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eric. Was there any public comment?
Yes, Chair, we have 2 public comments for 1027. The first one I'm going to call on is Melissa Camacho Chung.
Okay, Melissa, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Melissa Camacho Chung with the ACLU of Southern California. My work's primarily in the LA County jails. And just as the ESC takes this back and starts to discuss what it means to have a sufficient number of personnel, just a request to be talking about this also in terms of the problem mainly being the jails overpopulated. The LA County jails are generally operating well above what should be the population cap. And so when we're talking about safety checks and meals being served and all of those sorts of problems, generally the problem is that there are too many people in the jails and not necessarily that there aren't enough, in our case, LASD staff. So to just note that any discussion that ESC has in this provision should be, I guess, looked at also with the lens of what to do when the issue is primarily overcrowding and not a lack of personnel.
Great, thank you, Melissa.
And next we have Robin.
Robin,
Hey,
please.
thank you. Yes, I would also echo that these staffing plans that I believe Mr. Gutierrez mentioned, those are made for normal operating conditions, right? So when we're double occupancy for facilities, that no longer seems like the correct number of staff to be the goal. I was on a call earlier this morning with a facility up north that their average is a 20% vacancy rate in staffing. So on their best day, they're only staffed at 80%. That facility is San Quentin, which I know is a state facility, but it's a similar issue. San Diego County, where I live, has had a major suicide issue in its county facilities. I would venture to guess that that is related to staffing as well. And regarding the comment about considering facility type instead of ratios, is there not an opportunity to create ratios based on facility type instead of blanketed? And lastly, I would just to clarify, I believe Allison mentioned that BSCC could sort of work on definitions for sufficient number of personnel. So I'm wondering what is the plan for next steps in doing that? Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Did we lose Allison?
I'm sorry?
Oh, I was just making sure you were still there.
Oh, I'm still here.
Good.
Yes. So again, if what I'm hearing is this should go back to staff for reevaluation, and I do hear that this term sufficient be looked at. I don't want to get too nerdy about performance-based versus prescriptive regulations. Again, this is a very performance-based regulation because it is not the policy and procedure at a local detention facility. Each local detention facility determines their policy based on this regulation. So when we go and look at a staffing plan, they might have ratios built in a particular agency. So every agency has a certain number of staff, minimum staffing, that have to be working in a facility to complete the operations. They'll call people in if there are vacancies. But again, we are looking at what the minimum staffing to safely operate that facility is, and if they're meeting those minimums. So again, it's going to look very different. The policy is going to look different in every facility, but we can certainly take it back, get more feedback, and see what where best practices can be inserted to make sure that the regulation does what it's intended to do.
Great, thank you. Next is 1027.5 safety checks, and there is proposed revisions, and it is substantive, so we should.
Sure. So this is an interesting place to mention, where there was an original executive steering committee recommendation related to this regulation. And again, it doesn't substantively change the prescriptive every 60 minutes having a safety check. But there was a recognition that, and also in discussion with the BSCC inspectors, that where there are processes for supervisors to review completed safety checks, there are less and less issues of non-compliance, because it creates a level of accountability. So the ESC's recommendation was wholly adopted by the work group in this instance. And so what it requires is that not only do agencies have policy to have at a minimum 60-minute safety checks, but they also need to have a process where completed safety checks are reviewed. Now, how they do it will look different in every facility, but we will be looking for that process and evidence of that process when we do our inspections.
Okay, any comments from the ESC, please? No, okay. Adam, are there any public comment?
Yes, I have one public comment. Well, actually two. Avalon is the first one.
Okay, Avalon, please.
Hi, everybody. I realize I have failed to introduce myself every time I've talked before now. My name is Avalon. I work with Starting Over Inc. and Riverside All of Us or None, and I've been in a lot of direct contact with folks in Riverside County custody and their loved ones over the past year. I just like to encourage more conversation about whether or not 60 minutes is too long of a lapse between safety checks. Primarily, I'm thinking about one man who I spoke to who has been denied his proper insulin dosage for a long time, and actually went into a coma, and the emergency button in his room didn't work. And so the only way that they could get the attention of guards, I think his cellmate had to scream just like kind of for several minutes before they could get a guard to come. That being said, I know that's a specific example, and I know there's a lot there that clearly went wrong. But there's a lot that can happen in 60 minutes is what I'm trying to say. And like specifically in terms of medical emergencies, if people aren't being checked on more frequently than that, people can die and do die. People die of natural causes all the time in jails. And I'm wondering how much of that we could be more proactively preventing if there were more frequent safety checks. So I'm just wondering if there could be some more conversation about the 60-minute lapse as the minimum standard. Thanks.
Thank you.
Chair, I have two more. The next would be Renee Menard.
Okay. Renee, please.
Hi, thank you. Renee Menard with the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice. I also, share the concern with the 60-minute consideration right now. Recognizing on top of all that we know can happen in that time in correctional facilities, I also think it's interesting to look at best practices in other fields that are very relevant. So one resource I found in particular that I thought was interesting to provide additional guidance is the American Psychiatric Nurses Association, recognizing the vulnerable population that they support and the overlap in many people being in correctional facilities, particularly jails with mental health diagnoses. I think it's interesting to see that in a survey done by the association, only about 15 or 16% had checks every 60 minutes. The majority had checks every 15 minutes. That was close to 60% of those surveyed. And another 26% had checks every 30 minutes. So it was really in the minority to be waiting as long as 60 minutes for those checks. And I echo the concerns that a lot can happen in that time, and providing support and at the very least that visual contact is incredibly important. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Renee.
Chair, I have two more actually. First one will be Andrea.
Thank you. Andrea Garcia, Ponce de Leon, San Bernardino Freedom All. I definitely share the same concerns. We saw an uprise recently in San Bernardino County jails where folks were asking for medical attention, and also crisis intervention and response was needed for several folks that had shared that they needed suicide prevention or were intending to hurt themselves, and were told by staff they had to wait and they had to hold on. And that is unacceptable. And if there could be further discussion on the 60-minute duration for the safety checks, I think this is a conversation that needs to be had. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
And last, we have Ruben. Ruben, you want to go ahead?
Hi, yes, my name is Ruben Espinoza, and I'm with Fresno's Barrios Unidos here in Fresno, California. And I just really want to echo what everybody has uplifted and raised about the 60-minute check-ins, safety checks. You know, even if the facilities are in compliance with those 60-minute check-in safety checks, that is way too long of a gap to be checking in on people. As a person who has actually been inside on the inside, I've seen many things go awry in a matter of 15 to 30 minutes. So, you know, I just really want there to be more discussion around these safety checks and the time lapse in between them. So I just wanted to uplift that and echo everybody what they've said on this issue.
Great, thank you, Ruben. Adam, any more comments?
At this time, we have no further comments.
Okay. And so, Allison, I think that one also needs to be referred back to look at a little closer.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Still under Article 3, moving on to the next page, which is 1028 fire and life safety staff. There are no proposed revisions, but I'll pause for any public comment.
I do not have public comment at this time. If anyone is interested in speaking on this topic, please raise your hand or put your name in the chat. I'll call your name.
Great, thank you, Adam. Next is 1029 Policy and Procedures Manual. There are proposed revisions.
And so this is a pretty hefty regulation. It's the regulation that requires at a minimum what should be in detention facility policy and procedures manual. It is not exhaustive. This does not cover the only things that are required to be in a policy and procedure manual. Federal, state, local, all sorts of other things influence what's in a facility manual. But again, this is the minimum. So first change is ensuring that carotid holds are prohibited in accordance with current federal and state legal requirements. We've taken out some language that's really unnecessary related to releases. The statutes do change from time to time. So the procedure and screening for newly received inmates without the specific code called out. We are changing the term segregation throughout the regulations and renaming it to separation. So that's just a recognition of that. And the work group also felt that there should be a policy in each manual that talks about releases and release planning for each individuals. That was an important recognition that the work group wanted to see in there. And the last one is a typo. We do try to clean those up from time to time. So again, couple of changes, and this is the minimum what needs to be in facility policy and procedure manuals.
Thank you,
I have a
Allison.
question. Oh,
Anything from the executive steering committee?
Yeah, I have I just seek a little clarification on the release policy. It kind of implies that there's some sort of reentry where, you know, in jail systems, there are pretty frequent short-term and longer-term releases. And there may be some individuals that some agencies offer that process for, but this almost implies that there has to be a plan for each individual. So I don't know if we want to clarify that a little bit cleaner where it doesn't so broad. You know, the penal code does require certain releases during certain times now. There's some things that have happened throughout the recent years, but I just don't know if we can clarify a little bit better or drill down a little bit more on that, what they mean by it.
And we can certainly look into that. We can flag that as a topic to look into.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was one of my questions is, you know, what the expectations of, you know, the plan was. I know there are some continuity of care, you know, between jail medical and programs on the outside. I wasn't sure if it was referring to more than that. So it'd be nice to know what the expectation was, I guess.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm just scrolling through the text here. So what we can do, rather than me trying to find it, is I can come back to everybody with what the specific discussion related to that revision was, if that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that would be good.
hi, so I've been, I have a question just on a broader level about this manual. I noticed that it seems like this, you know, there's like certain kind of broad categories that it's supposed to cover, but I don't see anything in here relating to like broader protected categories around discrimination, equal protection types of issues as well. Is there a reason why, like some of those topics that like free speech issues, like, is there a reason why that's not actually in this manual?
So the best response is that this is not meant to be exhaustive. And I certainly hear what you're saying. Sheriffs and chiefs of police are beholden to every single state and federal law and requirement that applies to them, not just Title 15. That's not to say a couple of things. That's not to say that those types of things couldn't be required by Title 15. I'm not an expert. They are likely required by some other law and will appear in that policy and procedure, number one. And number two, throughout the regulations, there are places where there's a policy and procedure required in a certain subject matter area that's not necessarily called out in the policy and procedure manual. So it's not really a good lineup for everything that needs to be in policy and procedure manuals, like safety checks isn't in the policy and procedure manual because there's a regulation that says the agency has to have a policy and procedure for that. So again, specific to free speech and discrimination, I don't believe, feel like I know every single word of every regulation, but I could be wrong. I don't know that appears anywhere else in Title 15. But I feel like some other law requires that and requires it to be in a policy and procedure. Again, not to say it couldn't be put in Title 15, but there are a lot of other requirements on a sheriff or a chief of police that won't necessarily be called out in Title 15.
And I hear that. I think more so what I'm thinking about is like the intersection of Title 15 with like being able to actually carry out Title 15 effectively and not having like some of the other laws that are intersectional with being able to do this. I'm not, you know, I don't know what I don't know what it's going to end up saying. I mean, I've seen some, but to me, I feel like there are places where understanding like, you know, just specifics around like protected categories of individuals and understanding, you know, like just basic like constitutional issues that deal with like separation of incarcerated people and et cetera. Like it's hard to me, it's hard to talk about those things without also having some additional language that's related to that. So I guess that's kind of where, not I guess, that is where that's coming from for me.
Mhm. So, and I'm not sure, and I hope this is helpful for everybody. I'm not sure if what you're suggesting is something exhaustive or something general that might call out where an agency needs to, you know, adhere to all other laws and that are applicable to them, or something that would require a closer look at each of the regulations. And I guess I don't have a good example. I have one rattling around in there, but there's not enough time for me to babble it out. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, maybe like there needs to be a closer look at, because I can't really, in my head, when I see that, I'm like, oh, how does one know how to properly do separation of incarcerated individuals without understanding other laws that clearly intersect with Title 15? So to me,
PREA is a
right,
good
exactly.
example.
So it's just right, PREA. So it's not to me what the language has right here is not necessarily clear enough to give that guidance, in my opinion, to know that that's what's also should be covered in this manual. And I think that lack of like clarity could potentially lead to there not being a clear understanding that, you know, like PREA.
Yeah, and I really do want people to jump in. The lack, because I certainly, there is so much, and I don't want to speak for facility administrators. There are so many laws and statutes and case laws that, you know, each agency needs to make sure they're applying to, and Title 15 isn't intended to, and I'm not just, you know, as a point of reference, Title 15 isn't intended to capture all of those things. Like policies and procedures for strip search, it would be impossible to embed those into Title 15 because of the requirements, the state and federal requirements on them. And so I'm not sure if regulations are the best place to say that the agency administrator needs to adhere to all of those other things, because they already do apply. And I'm not trying to say it shouldn't be a thing, but I don't know if regulations are the place for them. But that's a definite good discussion.
Yeah, I think I'd like some more discussion, because I do think that there are specific topics that are called out that, to me, I don't understand. Like, I don't see how we could talk about one, and the manual could talk about one without talking about the other. So I hear your point, and that makes a lot of sense to me. But I also think that if it's going to call out specific topics like separation of incarcerated individuals, that you can't do that without like having further, you know, like further clarity for that particular topic. So.
Okay.
Was there any other comments from the ESC?
Yeah, and I just to help Allison on that too is it can't encompass everything. And every year the legislature with law changes, we're having to update these policy procedures. This is by no stretch of the imagination an all-inclusive list. There's so many policies that help the administrator manage the jail systems. And all of those are public record too, their policies. And that was a law change not too long ago where agencies have to post those. So they're pretty out there. You can go to the agencies and look at all their policies, and you can see there's quite a few.
Can I add something, Allison? It's Eloisa.
Oh, sure.
I also wanted to add, like, I had similar, you know, like, oh, can we add this? Can we add that? But then through this process, I learned, you know, at the end of the day, everything has to be approved by the Office of Administrative Law.
you have to provide a justification and a rationale. And they have their own team of attorneys who are looking to make sure we're not doing unnecessary duplication or making things even more vague or confusing. So sometimes we're even just kind of, constrained by this is just the state process.
Thank you, Aloysia. And Aloysia is one of our field representatives, just so everybody knows. Some of the requirements around, so these, not to bore people or to nerd out too much, these regulations, BSCC facilitates them being revised, but then they go through a whole host of scrutiny by the Office of Administrative Law, and we can't duplicate and we can't conflict with other laws. So perhaps the discussion could be around, it might be helpful to hear or get feedback about what could be contained in here if it isn't somewhere else in regulation, or where it might require clarification. I think that's a good discussion to have.
And were there any public comments on this section?
There are no public comments for this item.
Nope. Great, thank you. So it sounds like we have some referral work to do, correct? Allison?
Excuse me, it does look like there is a public comment. It looks like Avalon, not to, I know I'm just the ESC, but I'm looking at the chat and it looks like there was a public comment.
Avalon, you go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I raised my hand. I might not have, I intended to. There's a lot that I wanted to say about this. So I'm wondering if I could have a little flexibility on the 1 minute, just because a lot was brought up that I wasn't planning on talking about. I think there was a short discussion about whether or not this should apply to people who are being released after a short term of being held in custody. I think it absolutely should. I heard there was hesitation, and that was why it was brought up, but reentry and release planning should always apply to anybody who's been incarcerated for any amount of time, considering that even being incarcerated for 24 hours can lead to losing your job. Being incarcerated for a week can lead to losing custody of your children. There's real consequences for short-term incarceration, which means there need to be real thoughtful planning for reentry. In addition to that, I just wanted to echo a lot of what Aubrey said. I hear that we can't duplicate everything in Title 15, but maybe Title 15 can link to the exact regulation in state or federal law that applies. Because speaking as a community member, people don't have time to read everything in the Title 15 regulations and then read through all of the state and federal regulations to see what overlaps and what doesn't, and what applies to jails and what doesn't. So if Title 15, or maybe there's a separate document that could be put together that lists all of the things that need to be covered in this kind of manual, but that Title 15 isn't going to get into, that could be really helpful, because putting all those things in one place seems really necessary. Besides that, I just want to encourage the ESC to get into the specifics. I know that there's a lot of barriers in the way, including other existing regulations and the fact that these apply to a lot of different kinds of facilities and therefore a lot of different kinds of people who are coming in and out of the system. But ensuring that people get connected to the reentry resources that they need needs to be specific. Like, that needs to be a specific conversation. There has to be a standard for that. And just saying that there needs to be a plan, I don't think is sufficient for that. And then one more thing that didn't get brought up is that the work group in their discussion for this item concluded that basically it would be quote unquote unnecessarily burdensome to require local agencies to provide transportation to individuals upon release. But it did seem to indicate that that was within the BSCC's powers to require that. I think that's worth having a conversation as well, because if not local detention facilities, who is currently taking care of the transportation needs of released people? Can detention facilities partner with public transportation agencies to have readily available bus and train day passes, for example? If this is within the authority of the BSCC, I think I would encourage a more thorough conversation about the transportation needs of people leaving local detention facilities. I feel like it's kind of irresponsible to say that we could do this, but it would be too hard for local detention facilities to handle, so we won't talk about it anymore. Speaking as somebody who works for a nonprofit that currently is scrambling to meet the transportation needs of people in custody, this could be much more easily done by a local facility if they took the time to plan for that. Thanks for giving me a little extra time there.
Sure, and I do want to clarify that Title 15 applies to the operation of local detention facilities and the operations within. It doesn't apply to transportation issues. So I do want to point that out. We don't have the authority to mandate services that occur outside the local detention facility. And again, the regulations set the framework for the individual policy and procedures. And just again, the different resources and operations in each detention facility. Yes, it's a broad statement about release planning, and the intent is so that agencies can develop whatever plans are possible in that community with the services that they have in that facility. It is broad, it is performance-based.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the topic is worthy of further discussion. And I like a lot of the comments. I guess my question as a, former jail commander is, certainly I think there could be, a Title 15 implication, but, is it the function of probation, or maybe is it more appropriately aligned with Health and Human Services to assist with that planning, and where that actually falls? And I don't know enough about, like, say, Health and Human Services, for example, to know what their regulations are. So I'm just wondering if Title 15 is the appropriate place to capture that. And I certainly agree with the concept. I'm just wondering what's appropriate in terms of who does that and who's best suited to connect them with the resources outside of the jail facility. Because I know in my area, it probably would be Health and Human Services.
So if I hear correctly, this comes back for further feedback and further review.
Yeah, I would think so, unless there was any further public comment on it.
There are no public comments on this item.
Okay. Thank you, Adam. Okay. Next is 1030 Suicide Prevention Program, and there are proposed revisions. So I will defer to Allison.
I do also, we are going to end the meeting at 6 o'clock in accordance with the plans that we had made. So I want to just check in with the chair and the ESC about getting through this one discussion and then perhaps pausing to see what the next steps are. So there's time to discuss that. I know that, I had many expectations for how the meeting would go and next steps. So perhaps we can take a pause after this regulation and figure out what the next meeting looks like. So suicide prevention program, you can see a lot of revision and thought has gone into this. This regulation was compared with the guidelines that are considered best practices for suicide prevention in local detention facilities. And a lot of those best practices are reflected in the work of Lindsay Hayes, who has completed many, many studies of suicide in detention facilities. And also the guidelines for the National Commission on Correctional Health Care. So the regulation was pretty prescriptive, and you can see those are where there's no strikeout and underlines, but some recognition that each suicide prevention program and each agency shall consider national best practices rather than just suicide prevention training for staff that have direct contact with people in the facility. Annual suicide prevention training for all custodial personnel, not just those that have direct contact. Screening during special situations, not just intake screening. For instance, when people come back from court, or their classification is changed, or they've been put in a restrictive housing situation. Again, recognizing that people's risk levels fluctuate throughout their stay, and certainly after special situations. Communication among staff in the facility, including those in the court. So they are aware of a person's risk when they enter a different type of facility, again, facilitating communication. And housing recommendations, not only that just take into account a person's risk, but that balance safety and environment, and that the least restrictive environment is considered. And the last few, just developing corrective action plans to address deficiencies in an administrative review of suicides and attempted suicide. Provisions for follow-up care and plan for mental health consultation following the return from court as needed. So that's a lot. This is an interesting regulation because just a few short years ago, it was a one-liner and it said that agencies shall have a policy and a program to prevent suicide. And it really has come a long way to properly align it with readily available national best practices. So happy to take any conversations. The ESC did recommend that the work group and BSCC staff take a good hard look at those best practices.
And Allison, could I ask that you scroll down just a little bit for the ESC recommendations?
Sure.
Any discussion from the ESC?
This is, oh, go ahead.
Section C, I think is a lot of great additions to this this section, but section C on the only thing, the latter part of that, the sentence there where it talks about transfer or change in classification, I'm not aware of, I've read a lot of Mr. Hayes' stuff and necessarily needing it for a change of classification. That could be quite frequent. You know, when we're doing reviews, I don't know if it's really that necessary. All the other ones seem very appropriate, but I just want to know if that's a little bit unnecessary on transfer and change of classification, those two sections right there.
Do others have comments or discussion about that?
And actually I think Pamela was going to say something before me.
Oh yeah, I had comments about the overall reg, but not about that particular.
Oh, okay. Yeah, actually me too. So I should.
That's okay.
Who would like to go?
Go ahead, Aubrey. Go ahead, Aubrey, and I'll go after you.
Oh, okay. So my comments are actually about what the training is supposed to look like, and you know, we just went through another section where we were talking about the number of hours, and to me, it doesn't have enough information to know what that actually is going to mean. Is it just like a slideshow that someone may look at? You know, what does the training actually mean, and how long is it supposed to be? I think that that's important. And I was trying to scroll through and see custodial personnel, like what that means as well. And also, like, I'm sorry, go ahead. Was someone saying something? Oh, okay. And also I actually think that maybe it should be for more individuals than just custodial personnel. So that's kind of my comments on that particular piece. I actually do think that the transfer or change in classification is something that we should probably review a little bit more. I do think it's important because I think that based on my experience and the work that we do, a change or a transfer in classification can, you know, be something that is significant to an individual. And so I do think that, you know, I actually agree that there should be screenings at that time. So maybe that's something we should look at a little bit more, because I actually do agree that transfer, change in classification is important. And then I wasn't really sure in subsection K, where it says the plan for our mental health consultation following return from court as needed. I don't know what that means. And then I also don't know what the mental health consultation actually consists of. And so I would like a little bit more clarity on that piece.
So for that one, that is reflective of a guideline that was developed by the National Commission on Correctional Health Care as a standard. I'm going to say that likely what it means is, you know, if somebody gets some bad or traumatic or troubling news at court, that there is some sort of a consultation with a mental health professional. Now, the difficulty is that not every single agency has personnel, mental health personnel staffing the facility 24/7. So it's difficult to say that they get to see a clinician or they get to see that person. Some county facilities at certain parts of the day rely on the county crisis intervention team. So I think why it's performance-based is to allow for whatever that community can provide. But again, the policy that the agency develops has to be clear in what they're actually doing, right? So in one agency, it might be their resources might indicate that every person that comes back from court checks in with the mental health clinician because they have 24/7 staffing, you know, in that agency. Another agency, it could be there's contact with the crisis intervention team and somebody standing by to respond to the facility in the event of an issue. So a lot of it is, again, coming from national best practices and from the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare, but we can certainly, you know, dig through the intent of that a little deeper as well.
Yeah, I would very much appreciate that because I can immediately think of a number of disparities that you know, could come about because of that, and especially in thinking about mental health of individuals who are. I mean, to me, I don't think that should be the rationale, as if there's enough individuals who could, you know, sufficiently be a part of that process. Like, I just don't think that should be the rationale for that, and that it can vary so much from facility to facility.
So I'll agree with that. I think that you're right, but some places like LA County that have 2,000 inmates going to and from court every day, I think we have to put some guidelines in here, because a place that has 10 inmates or 15 going to and from court, they can probably screen everybody pretty easily. But for a large place, LA County, San Bernardino, Orange County, places like that, we probably want to get some guidelines on, you know, if you get life without, maybe for sure you would want to go through some screening or some other significant sentencing screening, or other, somebody said bad news in there, we'd have to define that obviously much better, but something so we could try and capture those that mental health professionals might think are at risk more than others. And I think that's certainly welcome. I see in number C here, it says screening during special situations. I think that's extremely broad, and I'm not sure what that means. I would like to see some clarification on that. And the changes in classification, we've already talked about a little bit, but if you're going from a higher classification to a lower classification where you're going to have more freedoms and things like that, generally that's not all that bothersome. Individual cases, there could be an issue, but I think if you're going into a disciplinary classification or you're going to a higher classification or something to that effect, it's certainly worthy of some screening and some guidelines for that.
I just want to, the only thing I bring up to add on this is just reminding ourselves that these are supposed to be minimum standards that we're establishing, and in the different types of jail systems throughout California, and trying to get these, you know, a decent minimum standard, like you'd mentioned, Eric. C is just broad and it all over the place, and I'm just concerned it'll unnecessarily set these counties up for failure to meet a standard that you can't even clearly define. And you hit it on the nail on the head, where a change in classification could be a request upon the inmate. We're going to a lesser classification, more freedoms. There's no need to waste precious resources that are needed for for individuals who are seriously mentally ill, to where they can focus their efforts there and divert to talk to an individual who has to be less than his classification level and has absolutely zero issues. I think we have to look at and think through as best we can the impact that this has on agencies. And so we need to, I think, really look at it as a minimum standard and try to hold to that.
Okay, good. Was there any public comment?
Oh, actually, I had This is Pamela Liu.
Pamela Liu, please go ahead.
Yes, so for B, subsection B, intake screening for suicide risk immediately upon intake. Disability Rights California had requested that there be done by nursing staff or clinical staff, just based on some investigations we've done and reviews of litigation in different jails where it was determined that people going through the intake process tend to be more forthcoming when they're speaking to clinical staff and not to custodial staff, because they're concerned that if they reveal or disclose anything about suicidal attempts or past suicidal, that it'll be used negatively against them, and it won't, and they'll tend not to disclose those incidents. And then in terms of a definition of suicide attempt, and that would go to the new subsection I, we also found that jails, different jails in terms of data reporting have unfortunately minimized suicide attempt by having a very restricted definition of what that is. And so if we're trying to develop best practices or national standards, the Centers for Disease Control actually has a definition of suicide attempt that we're recommending be actually inserted into this regulation. And I just copied it into the chat for the BSCC staff.
Great.
So that's actually from their website.
And yes, we can absolutely take a look at that. I think the section B, again, and I don't want to just objectively, I want to objectively say probably, I know from my experience that not every agency has 24/7 nursing or clinical staff. So especially on some of the, overnight graveyard shifts, there might not be that type of personnel available. So again, it's balancing balancing an intake screening versus what type of staff are actually available at the facility. I know that would be a burden for sure for some facilities. Not that it's not important.
No, I think it's important, but like we talked about, it's good to talk about what the industry standards are and these sort of things, but we're establishing minimum standards. And the actual act is we're requesting that should be done, and it should. Dictating who that person, who does it and what classification is another story, I think.
Anything else from the ESC? Okay, anyone from the public, please?
Yes, we have 3 public commenters. The first one will be Richard.
Richard, please.
Hi, good evening. Not to be rude, but I'll keep this brief looking at the clock. And my question was going to be about custodial personnel, if we could clarify that, simply because that's pretty, again, echoing prior comments, is that concerning that we have limited training hours, training dollars, I would rather see staff be trained on de-escalation, mental health issues, rather than administrative staff who will never see an inmate get training in suicide prevention.
In the definitions for custodial personnel, the easiest way to put it is staff that have direct supervision over the people that are housed in detention facilities. I don't know that it helps or solves the issue. So just
that's exactly it. Perfect. And I'm assuming that's a cut and paste from the definition somewhere else in the regulations, correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Next, we have Avalon.
Hi, I'll keep it brief as well, because I also want to talk about the scheduling for the next meeting, and I know that's next on the agenda. I just wanted to encourage the ESC and the work group to actually look at the juvenile Title 15 regulations. They also recently made some really major improvements to their suicide prevention plan. It's item 1329 on their Title 15 regulations. One major one that I want to highlight is just, they say that those at risk for suicide shall not be denied the opportunity to participate in facility programs, services, and activities which are available to other non-suicidal individuals unless deemed necessary for the safety of the individual or security of the facility. There's several others, but I'd just like to say I think they did an excellent job reviewing that, and they have certain changes that were not made here. So I just encourage the work group to visit those juvenile regulations.
Great, thank you.
And last, we have Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrea San Bernardino Freedom All. And this is in relation to A through Okay, I think there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had here concerning all of these because they are so very much important. This is a part of a larger conversation as a prevention worker, especially as I mentioned earlier regarding suicide prevention. We were reached out to by folks that were experiencing these traumas and had repeatedly asked for intervention of custodial personnel where they were denied and told they had to wait, and they waited several hours. But in other circumstances that could have been looked very differently. So I would encourage this committee to hold off on this conversation and expand it in a larger and broader scope. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Adam, were there any final requests?
I'm sorry, at this time, there are no other comments.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, it sounds like, Allison, we've got a little bit more work to do on this one as well. So I think probably we're at a natural stopping point. First, I just want to thank everybody for the input. I know there's a lot of heavy lifting going on, to use the term, but it's all very valuable and everyone's input is appreciated. I had a recommendation, Allison, I'll just throw it out there, but given some of the follow-up that needs to be done, I don't know if it's, attainable, so I'll get your input as well. But I was going to recommend maybe finding a date somewhere near the middle to end of August, and then allowing us time to work on some of these, and then allowing time for additional public comment prior to that meeting. And my thought was based on my belief of what the governor is going to do, I think we could maybe try to meet back in person, and maybe schedule a full day or longer if necessary, to make some, good progress on this. So at least that's my recommendation, but I'll defer to you and see what you think.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I will say from personal experience, it would be really wonderful to have an in-person meeting, and certainly the longer after the everything opens back up is ideal. I like the idea of August. It keeps us on the trajectory to get the revisions to the board before the end of this year, so we can get the regulations put into we can make the regulations effective. And we could also make sure to open up some really focused public comment through July to make that happen. What I would like to do is get back to everybody relatively soon about a date and a firm process for requesting additional public comment, making sure that we build in some time for the BSCC staff to compile and do the research, both on the comments that were made this evening and the public comments that we'll get throughout. So I would like to ask, tentatively, we can plan something for end of August and make sure that there's a sufficient time for public comment, but that we will make a final decision and get back to everybody very, very soon on that process, especially given what the state of affairs is in the world. It's so much easier to get through these meetings in person. So if that sounds suitable and the ESC members are amenable to that, we can get back to everybody, including the public members, as soon as possible.
This is Pamela, ESC member. I'm seeing a lot of comments about wanting to get feedback from incarcerated individuals, and that to me has been the part that I have felt has been the most missing in this process. And I think it's absolutely essential that as we're trying to really craft something that's thoughtful and that's going to affect the most directly impacted, we should figure out how to do that. And I don't know if the August timeline would be realistic. I'm also seeing a comment about if we could bring in formerly and currently incarcerated people into the ESC, and I would also agree with that.
So absolutely, and that's why I'm probably hesitating a little bit, because we have dates in mind, but certainly we need to be respectful of the comments from the public. I do want to say we absolutely had formerly and system involved people on the executive steering committee and on work groups. And unfortunately, over time, many of those people dropped off. We haven't heard from some people. It's been really difficult to reform this ESC, and even people that weren't able to participate this evening. I don't want that to sound like we tried, but we absolutely want to ensure that those voices are heard in this process. So when I say we have a tentative plan, we won't make a final decision tonight, especially given the chat that you're seeing and consideration for those voices. So we need to put our heads together as staff and with the ESC and pick a timeline that does work the best. So thank you. You're on mute. I forgot my "You're on mute" t-shirt for this evening.
I just, one comment on that is I think for a number of us on this, we have paid employment that enables us to participate. But I think for some other individuals, they're working different jobs and it's a big sacrifice for them to take all these hours out. And I don't know if that's something the board can consider, but I think even a stipend or some way to compensate people for their time. And there's also the issue of people who are currently incarcerated and getting their feedback, not just the formally. So.
Absolutely. Good,
yeah.
Good feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I was like actually thinking, I don't know if there's actually some kind of like something operational that can be put in place in order to get that feedback, especially from incarcerated individuals, like more quickly than the several months. So like, is there something that can be done? Is there something that's already been like thought of in order to like kind of speed up the process to get like mail correspondence back?
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. And when I was sharing the screen, I couldn't see the chat. I'm seeing more of the chat now, and we've had conversations. I really want to acknowledge that we want to make sure that those voices are included as well. I know that there are people out there that can facilitate getting those voices. And what we want to do is after this call, get more information on what that looks like so we can better make a plan. So I'm saying, I don't want to say the meeting will be in August. I want to say, our original plan was to get these regulations to the board by the end of the year. And after talking with you all and talking with people that can help facilitate that process, we might come up with a very different date. And I ask people to be patient. We're not going to wait too long to find that date, but there's a lot of moving parts that we need to figure out. So thank you for that.
I think the most important thing we have to do is continue to move forward. I've been very encouraged by the participation, by the opinions, by the professionalism of this forum. I think we just need to keep moving forward, and we can begin to make changes and bring in, formerly incarcerated, which I see on the threads we have formerly incarcerated. They're so valuable to this process, but we have to remember we're trying to do this. We need to keep a schedule, and nothing's perfect, but we need to make positive progress, and then we can amend and adjust from there and just keep furthering the goals of getting this thing to the correct state.
So I want to have a few moments so that people that would like to make final public comment can do that. I'm just trying to really quickly go through the chat. All of this information we'll put on our website if you bookmark that piece. Absolutely, we really want to make sure that we hear from everybody impacted in this process, and we will be working with and reaching out to, and we encourage you to reach out to us to facilitate that process. And so perhaps, Adam, you could let us know. I don't want to actually, does the ESC have any final comment, and then we can go to our final public comment?
Sorry, I actually do have one comment. Is the chat, like the public part of the chat, is that considered part of the, like, how is that considered logistically? Like, are you all capturing that in the
Yes.
okay.
So we'll capture that. The recording's gonna be on our website, and I'm sure we could figure out how to post the chat, but we as staff will make sure that if we can't answer any questions as we're running out of time, that we do address some of those. We'll figure out a way to put it on our website. Some of this is new and different to us. This is the biggest meeting that I've run on Zoom, so we'll figure that part out. Please, please be patient with me. My degree is not in computer science, but we'll figure it out. I can assure you. I'm asking for the best contact information for people to reach out to BSCC. I'm gonna give you the regulations at bscc.ca.gov is the, oh, I didn't send that to everybody. I'll send that to everybody, and I can also, so anybody that writes to that email address, regulations@bscc.ca.gov, it can be a general question, it can be a comment, and we'll address those.
And Allison, if I could, and so I'm not sure, were there any other public comments from our community?
At this time, I don't see any raised hands. Oh, well, I do have one. I have Andrea, and then we'll call Robin.
Okay, Andrea, please.
And before, sorry to interrupt, I'm trying to read the chat. Absolutely, if we do have the meeting in person, again, we're getting better at this. If we do have the meeting in person, there will be a way for people to participate remotely. I wanted to make that a point as well. I mean, that's one good thing that came out of this, is that we can certainly facilitate remote participation.
Thank you. I'd just like to close with the thought that I have volunteered and will love to participate further with this committee as a formerly incarcerated person, and offer thoughts and suggestions and ways on how we can reach impacted voices. We do have members of our organization that are currently incarcerated and would very much love to be part of this. Their presence is very much needed and required here in this space, as we are making decisions on their behalf without having a place for them to talk about their concerns. Thank you.
Next, I have Robin.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I think any of the community members here that have spoken anyway can connect, help connect people in our networks to this committee. Regarding that regulations email address, I'm wondering if that is accessible for people using systems like JPay from emailing inside the facilities.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it should be. I can find out.
Okay.
It's just a plain old email address. Again, I pretend to know a lot about computers, but I don't know. I assume anybody can use that email and write to us on it.
Okay, and I'm wondering if BSCC would consider perhaps at least providing funds on the books for incarcerated people who do participate in things like this during committee.
That's something way beyond my my understanding right now. That's something we'd certainly have to look into. I don't know how that would work, but certainly a recommendation that we can bring forward.
Thank you.
And last, I have Brian Goldstein.
Good evening, Brian Goldstein with the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice. First, I want to thank the Executive Steering Committee and all the members of the public who spoke here today. First, just want to ask that the Executive Steering Committee hold off meeting until October. Again, that will ensure that we have enough time to reach out to individuals who are involved in the criminal justice system, individuals who are incarcerated, and can speak to how these regulations can best protect them. Feedback from our directly impacted communities is essential when we look at the Title 15 and 24 regulations on the juvenile side, including the voices, lifting up the voices of those who've been directly impacted, made those regulations stronger. These regulations, they're not about placing a burden on law enforcement. They are about placing protections to ensure our loved ones inside are kept safe. And we hope that the Executive Steering Committee continues to hold to that standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
That is all the public comments I have.
Great, thank you, Adam. Before I defer to Allison for any final comments, again, I just want to thank everybody, for your engagement, your involvement. We're embarking down this road to, really make some positive changes for the profession. And I appreciate everyone's input and time, so thank you. And I'll look forward to working with everybody here in the near future. Allison?
Thank you so much, Sheriff Barnes. Thank you, everybody participating on the ESC. Sorry, after 5 o'clock, my voice doesn't work. Everybody participating from the BSCC team and from the public and the community. We will put our heads together. We have some contacts in there. Please, if you would like to contact us about opportunities and facilitating opportunities for people to be more engaged in this process, please email us at regulations@bscc.ca.gov and we can get back to you and talk about that. And thank you very much for everybody spending time with us this evening. Tried to hold it at a time where more people could attend, and it seems like we did an okay job with that. So we'll continue to find times that work for people. The recording will be available on the website once we get it converted, and we'll put it up there on that same regulations revision website where we will continue to add relevant information and email people about future opportunities and future meetings. And we will get back to people soon about that. So thank you, everybody. Thank you and have a good evening. Thanks a lot for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.